He had everything: power, money, success. Yet every Christmas he sat alone in a house built on memories. But one stormy night, when a single mother and her little girl knocked on his door, his life took a turn no one could have imagined. What started as an act of kindness soon uncovered a secret that would change them all forever. Stay till the end, because this story will warm your heart and break it at the same time. Snow drifted quietly over the quiet town of Snow Ridge, Vermont, a postcard-perfect scene bathed in soft gold from the street lamps. Every house on Pine Hollow Road was dressed in holiday light, strings of color glowing through windows where families gathered around fireplaces and laughter danced through the night air. Every house except one, the biggest one, the one at the very end of the lane, the house that belonged to Graham Elridge. Inside, the silence was so complete that the ticking of a grandfather clock sounded like a heartbeat in an empty cathedral. The smell of aged oak and polished leather hung in the air, blending faintly with the smoke of the crackling fireplace. Graham stood in front of the tall window, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring at the snow-covered world outside. The faint reflection of his own face looked back at him, sharp, weary, and a little older than 35 should look. The flicker of light caught the grey in his temples, the tiredness in his eyes. It was Christmas Eve again, the night that everyone else waited for with joy, and he waited for in silence. Down the hill, a chorus of carolers sang joyfully. The melody floated through the frozen air and reached his home, muffled but clear. Silent night, holy night. He shut his eyes for a second. That song. He used to love it once. Before, Graham Elridge was the kind of man who had built his success from the ground up. The world saw him as a symbol of perseverance, the orphan who turned into a CEO, the visionary who founded Elridge Technologies, the company that changed how hospitals managed patient care. He was brilliant, meticulous, and driven beyond reason. People envied his mansion, his luxury car, his tailored suits. But no one envied his eyes, because they held the story he never told. 6 years ago, on a night just like this one, he'd lost everything that made his world worth living. His wife, Emma, was 6 months pregnant when it happened. She had insisted on driving to the city that afternoon. She wanted to surprise him with a Christmas gift she had ordered. He told her to wait until morning, but she laughed in that gentle way she always did and said, "If I don't get it tonight, you'll find out what it is too soon." It was the last time he heard her voice. The accident happened on the old bridge outside town. The ice had been invisible, black like the night sky. When the call came, Graham was in his office signing documents. He still remembered how the pen fell from his hand, how his chest went hollow, how he forgot to breathe. The world had ended quietly, without thunder or warning. Just a phone call, a siren, and silence. Since that night, Christmas had become his curse. The season everyone celebrated became the one he dreaded most. Every December 24th, he performed the same ritual. He poured one glass of scotch, lit the fireplace, and stood by the window. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't call anyone. He just watched the snow fall and imagined a life that could have been. His friends had stopped trying to reach out years ago. The employees at his company knew better than to wish him Merry Christmas. He had turned his heart into a fortress, and solitude became his punishment. Outside, laughter echoed again. Somewhere a child was squealing with joy, probably opening an early gift. Graham turned away from the window. The sound stabbed at something deep inside him, not anger, just an ache, dull and endless. He moved toward the fireplace and stared at the half-decorated Christmas tree in the corner. It was tall, elegant, and symmetrical. A professional decorator had set it up 2 weeks ago, just like every year. Perfectly arranged ornaments. A golden star, but to him it looked cold, soulless. He remembered the last Christmas he and Emma had shared. She had insisted they use mismatched ornaments because, as she'd said, the best trees are the ones with a story. He could still see her laughing as she hung a crooked red heart near the top, a cheap plastic ornament they had bought on their honeymoon. It was still there, near the back of the tree now, hidden behind layers of silver and gold. He reached out and touched it. The memory burned, and he pulled his hand away as though it hurt. He returned to the armchair and sat down, the firelight flickering across his face. The house creaked faintly as the wind outside picked up. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a soft sound, almost like footsteps. He frowned, setting his glass down, listening carefully. Nothing, just the wind brushing against the shutters. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The warmth of the fire and the faint hum of the clock filled the silence. He tried to picture Emma's face, the curve of her smile, the way her hair always fell over her eyes when she laughed. But even that was beginning to fade. The years had stolen her from him piece by piece, and that terrified him more than anything. A sharp knock broke through the quiet. 3 soft but distinct taps. He opened his eyes. The sound had come from the front door. For a second he thought he had imagined it. No one ever came here. He never had visitors, and certainly not on Christmas Eve. Another knock. This time louder, more certain. He frowned and stood up slowly, walking toward the entrance. The house felt suddenly enormous, the hallways stretching endlessly as he passed through them. The second knock came again before he reached the door, this time accompanied by a voice. A woman's voice. "Hello? Is anyone home?" Graham's steps slowed. A stranger's voice, soft, uncertain, but carrying warmth. He hesitated before reaching for the handle. Something about it felt unreal, almost dreamlike. He unlocked the latch and pulled the door open. The cold rushed in instantly, biting against his skin. Snowflakes drifted into the hallway. On the porch stood a young woman, bundled in a thick brown coat, a knitted scarf around her neck, and beside her, a little girl no older than 6, wearing a red hat with 2 fluffy pom-poms. They both looked slightly out of breath, as if they'd been walking for a while. "Good evening," the woman said, smiling awkwardly. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. We're your new neighbors. I'm Laya, and this is my daughter, Poppy." The little girl waved shyly, then held up a small red box wrapped in shiny paper. "We brought cookies," she said cheerfully. "We made them for everyone on our street." Graham blinked. The words barely registered. He glanced at the box, then at their faces, bright and open against the cold night. Their cheeks were pink from the wind, and the little girl's eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement only children carried. He could have easily told them he wasn't interested, that he didn't celebrate, that they had the wrong house. But something about them, maybe the innocence in the girl's voice, maybe the courage it took to knock on a stranger's door, stopped him. "Cookies," he repeated, as if testing the word. Poppy nodded vigorously. "Chocolate chip." "Mummy says they make people happy." Laya laughed softly. "We just moved in down the road and thought it might be nice to say hello to everyone before Christmas." "I hope that's okay." He found himself saying the words before he could stop them. "Would you like to come in?" Her eyebrows rose slightly, surprised. "Oh, we don't want to intrude. It's no trouble," he interrupted quietly. He stepped aside and gestured toward the warmth of the house. Laya hesitated, then nodded, gently nudging Poppy inside. The girl's eyes widened as she stepped into the grand foyer, looking around like she'd just entered a castle. "Wow," she whispered. "It's so pretty, but your Christmas tree looks sad." Graham blinked. "Sad? It doesn't have any friends," she said seriously. "You need to put more decorations." "It looks lonely." Laya gave an apologetic smile, but Graham felt an unexpected laugh escape him, small, genuine, almost foreign. "I suppose you're right," he said softly. A few minutes later they were sitting in the living room. Laya handed him the box of cookies, and Poppy was already busy hanging a candy wrapper on the lowest branch of his tree. The house, once cold and lifeless, felt different, warmer somehow, filled with a hum of energy he hadn't felt in years. As they talked, he learned they had moved from Boston after Laya lost her job. She'd found a small rental home nearby and was trying to start fresh. Poppy chatted about her new school, her favorite color, and how she wanted a puppy for Christmas. At some point, Laya noticed the framed picture on the mantel. A photo of Graham and Emma smiling under a Christmas tree. "She's beautiful," Laya said softly. Graham nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "She was." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, understanding. When they finally stood to leave, Poppy tugged his sleeve. "Can I come decorate your tree again tomorrow?" she asked. He almost said no. But when he looked down at her hopeful face, something inside him shifted. "Sure," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." As they walked away through the falling snow, their laughter fading into the night, Graham stood at the doorway, watching them go. For the first time in 6 long years, his house didn't feel quite so empty. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself hoping, really hoping, that someone would knock again tomorrow. The following morning, Graham woke up earlier than usual. The pale winter. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, painting thin streaks of gold across the wooden floor. The house was quiet as always, yet something in the air felt different, lighter, almost alive. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, his mind replaying the night before. The unexpected knock, the young mother's shy smile, and the little girl's laughter echoing through his empty halls. It all seemed almost unreal, like a dream that refused to fade after waking. He ran a hand over his face and exhaled deeply. For years, Christmas morning had meant nothing to him. He never opened gifts, never cooked breakfast, never even looked outside. But today, he found himself walking toward the window. Snow had piled up along the driveway overnight, untouched and glistening like powdered glass. The world outside was calm. No footsteps, no cars, no sound, just silence, heavy and soft. He didn't know why, but he half expected to hear another knock. When it didn't come, he almost laughed at himself. "What did you expect?" he muttered under his breath. "They're not coming back." Still, he couldn't shake the image of Poppy's bright eyes or the way she had looked at his tree, declaring it lonely. He walked into the living room, glancing at it again. Her candy wrapper still hung crookedly from one of the branches, a small, ridiculous detail that made him smile. It looked out of place among the perfectly arranged ornaments, but somehow it made the tree feel more real. By noon, Graham was sitting in his home office, trying to focus on work. A spreadsheet glowed on his laptop screen, but the numbers refused to make sense. His mind kept drifting back to that little red box of cookies. It still sat unopened on the counter. Finally, with a small sigh, he got up, unwrapped the box and tried one. It was slightly uneven, clearly homemade, soft in the center, crisp around the edges. He took a bite and froze. It was good. Not perfect, not something you'd find in a fancy bakery, but warm, real, comforting. He hadn't tasted something like that in years. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window. Outside, the snow began to fall again, heavier this time. The weather forecast had warned of an incoming blizzard, and he knew the roads would soon be covered. He glanced out toward the hill, where the road curved past his property and led to the cluster of smaller houses below. Somewhere down there, Lyra and Poppy were probably spending their first Christmas in their new home. He found himself wondering what that home looked like. Did they have a tree? Did they have enough heat? Was Poppy warm enough? The thought surprised him. He hadn't cared about anyone else's comfort in years. He shook his head, almost annoyed by his own concern. "You don't even know them," he muttered. Though the words didn't hold much conviction, hours passed and the snow continued to fall. By evening, the sky had darkened and the wind howled outside, pushing against the windows like waves on a shore. He poured himself another drink and sat by the fire, the orange glow flickering across his face. The storm outside grew louder. Every once in a while, a branch cracked under the weight of the snow, echoing through the night. Then, just as he began to doze off, there it was again, 3 knocks, soft but unmistakable. He blinked, straightened up and looked toward the door. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. The storm was roaring outside, and it could have easily been the wind. But then it came again, firmer this time. He stood slowly, heart beating faster than it should. Who would come here in weather like this? He walked through the hall, past the tall shadows of furniture, until he reached the door. He hesitated for just a second before pulling it open. Snowflakes swirled in, and there they were again. Lyra and Poppy, both wrapped in thick coats dusted with white. The little girl was clutching a small thermos in both hands. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," Leia said quickly, her breath visible in the cold air. "The power went out at our place. I didn't know where else to go." Before he could reply, Poppy looked up at him with wide eyes. "We brought cocoa," she said, lifting the thermos proudly. "Mommy said we should share it so we all stay warm." Graham stared at them for a moment, two figures standing in a snowstorm, trembling slightly but smiling anyway. He didn't think twice this time. "Get inside," he said firmly. "It's freezing out here." They stepped into the warmth of the house, brushing snow off their shoulders. Leia shivered as she took off her gloves. "I hope this isn't too much trouble," she said. "The storm came faster than we expected, and my generator's not working." "It's no trouble," he said quietly. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." She looked relieved, and Poppy immediately ran toward the fireplace. "Can we sit here?" she asked. "Of course," Graham replied. Soon the house was filled with the gentle sound of the fire crackling, the storm raging outside, and the faint hum of conversation. Poppy poured cocoa into 3 cups with careful concentration. Graham accepted his with an awkward smile. It had been years since anyone had offered him something so simple, and it felt strangely meaningful. "It's not very good," Poppy warned him seriously. "Mommy says I always add too much sugar." He took a sip. It was far too sweet, but he smiled anyway. "It's perfect," he said, and the little girl beamed. Leia looked around the living room. "You have such a beautiful home," she said softly. "But it feels quiet," Graham nodded. "It's been quiet for a long time." She hesitated before asking, "You live alone?" He stared into the fire for a moment. "Yes, for a long time now." The flames reflected in his eyes, and for a brief second she caught a glimpse of the loneliness he carried. Heavy, quiet, endless. She didn't push further. Instead, she changed the subject, telling him about their move from Boston, about how Poppy had begged for a big backyard, about how they found a tiny house they could barely afford, but loved anyway. As she spoke, he listened, really listened. Her voice filled the empty spaces in his home like music. Every so often, Poppy would interrupt with her own little stories, about a snowman she tried to build, about how she named the neighbor's cat Captain Fluffy, about how she wished Santa would bring her a dad who tells stories at bedtime. The words hung in the air for a moment too long. Leia froze, looking embarrassed. "Poppy," she began gently, but Graham only smiled faintly. "That's a very special wish," he said softly. "I hope Santa's listening." Poppy nodded seriously. "He always listens if you say it with your heart." Leia laughed, shaking her head. "She's got a big imagination." "That's a good thing," Graham said. "Imagination keeps the world alive." Hours passed without any of them realizing it. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the warmth grew, not just from the fire, but from the company. For the first time in years, Graham wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was simply there, present, alive, surrounded by laughter and light. When the clock struck 11, Leia stood reluctantly. "We should probably go. The storm's easing a little," but Graham frowned. "It's still dangerous," he said. "Stay here tonight. I have plenty of space." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Are you sure?" "I insist." That night he prepared the guest room himself. Fresh sheets, extra blankets, the heater turned up. Poppy was already half asleep on the couch, curled up with a blanket. Leia carried her to bed, whispering a soft thank you as she passed. When the house finally grew quiet again, Graham stood in the hallway, staring at the closed guest room door. For years, that part of the house had been lifeless, unused, untouched. But now he could hear the faintest sound of Poppy's breathing through the door. It filled the silence in a way he hadn't realized he'd missed. He returned to the fireplace where their cups still sat, half empty. On the table beside them, Poppy had left one of her mittens, tiny, pink, with a white snowflake stitched on it. He picked it up and smiled faintly. For the first time since Emma's death, he didn't feel like a ghost wandering through his own life. He felt connected, like maybe, just maybe, the universe hadn't forgotten about him after all. As he set the mitten down, he looked out the window once more. Snow still fell softly, but the storm had weakened. The world outside looked peaceful, and for the first time in 6 long years, Graham didn't feel dread when he looked toward Christmas morning. He felt anticipation, not for gifts or celebration, but for something far simpler. The sound of laughter in his house, the promise of company, the warmth of cocoa shared with strangers who didn't feel like strangers anymore. Somewhere deep in his chest, a small ember of hope stirred, fragile but real. He didn't know it yet, but that night, with 3 simple knocks and a thermos of cocoa, his entire world had begun to change. The next few days drifted by like gentle snowflakes, quiet but full of small, meaningful moments that seemed to settle deep inside Graham's heart. What had started as a chance encounter on a stormy Christmas Eve slowly turned into something that felt familiar, comfortable, alive. The morning after the blizzard, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the world outside in a blinding white glow. Graham found himself in the kitchen brewing coffee, something he rarely did, since most mornings began with a rush to his office downtown. But today he wasn't in a hurry. Today there were voices in his house, soft laughter from down the hall, the clinking of dishes, the sound of life. When he walked into the dining room, he found Poppy sitting cross-legged on a chair, munching on toast, her small legs swinging. Above the floor, Leah stood by the counter, her hair slightly messy from sleep, humming softly as she poured juice into a glass. It was the kind of ordinary scene Graham hadn't witnessed in years, a picture of domestic life that once would have belonged to him. For a moment, he just stood there taking it in. Poppy noticed him first. "Good morning, Mr. G," she said, grinning brightly. "Good morning," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "You're up early." "She doesn't sleep in when there's snow," Leah said, smiling. She wanted to build a snow fort before breakfast. Poppy nodded enthusiastically, bits of toast crumbs on her chin. "You can help us." Graham blinked. "Help you?" "Yeah. You can be the architect. Mommy says you're a businessman, and businessmen are good at building stuff," Leah laughed. "That's a very generous assumption." He smiled despite himself. "Well, I suppose I can make an exception for a snow fort." And he did. Later that morning, all 3 of them bundled up and stepped outside into the glittering snow. The air was crisp, their breath visible in the sunlight. Poppy was in charge, of course, directing where each snow wall should go, how tall it should be, and where the guard tower needed to stand. Graham followed her lead with quiet amusement, sculpting snow bricks with surprisingly careful precision. "You're good at this," Leah said, laughing as she watched him. "I had practice," he replied, smiling faintly. "Years ago, my wife and I used to build igloos together every winter." Leah paused, her expression softening. "She must have been special." "She was," he said quietly. "Still is." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like snow falling on glass. By the time they finished, their hands were frozen, their faces flushed with cold, and their snow fort stood proudly in the center of the yard, complete with a makeshift flag Poppy had crafted from her pink scarf. She stood back, admiring their work. "It's perfect," she declared. Leah smiled. "It really is." Graham glanced at her, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met, a moment so small it could have been missed. Yet it carried something unspoken. Gratitude, connection, maybe even healing. After they went back inside, Graham made hot chocolate for everyone. He wasn't sure why, maybe because it reminded him of something warm, something human. Poppy insisted on adding marshmallows to everyone's cup, even though half of hers melted into sticky foam. "Do you always make cocoa like this?" she asked curiously. "Not always," he said. "Usually I drink coffee." She wrinkled her nose. "Coffee's for grumpy people," he laughed. "Then maybe I should switch to cocoa." The laughter that followed filled the house, bouncing off the walls like a forgotten song returning to memory. Over the next few weeks, they began seeing each other more often. Leah started working part-time at a local cafe in town, the kind that smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans, with a bell above the door that jingled when you walked in. One morning, Graham stopped by after a meeting. He didn't plan to. He told himself he just wanted a cup of coffee, but deep down, he knew better. Leah looked up from behind the counter, surprised. "Mr. Elridge," she said with a smile. "You actually came." "Just Graham," he corrected gently. "And yes, I needed my caffeine fix." Poppy, who was coloring at a corner table, spotted him and waved. "Mr. G, look, I drew your snow fort." He walked over, crouching beside her. The crayon drawing showed 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small, all standing next to a lopsided fort with hearts drawn above it. He smiled. "You're quite the artist. I'm going to draw you a dog next," she said proudly. "You need a dog," Leah laughed from behind the counter. "Careful. She'll have you adopting one by next week." He smiled, shaking his head. "I've faced tougher negotiators." That became his routine. Every few mornings, he'd stop by the cafe, sometimes with a business excuse, sometimes without one at all. The staff began to notice, exchanging knowing smiles when he walked in. He'd sit near the window, watching Leah move gracefully between tables, her hair tied up, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, like someone who had weathered storms but still found beauty in small things. One evening, he offered to drive them home after a late shift. Snow was falling again, soft and steady. As they drove down Pine Hollow Road, the headlights illuminated the flakes like tiny stars. Poppy was half asleep in the back seat, clutching her drawing pad. Leah looked out the window. "You know," she said, "I wasn't sure moving here was the right decision. It's small, quiet, and I didn't know anyone. But now—" She paused. "Now I think it's the best thing that ever happened to us." He glanced at her, his voice low. "Sometimes the best things happen when we stop trying to plan them." She smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot." "I have," he admitted. "But lately, I'm beginning to think maybe the universe was saving something good for me." Her eyes met his in the glow of the dashboard lights, and she didn't reply. She didn't need to. As the days turned into weeks, winter began to soften. The icicles hanging from rooftops melted, and children started trading snow boots for raincoats. But for Graham, something far deeper was changing. The coldness that had wrapped around his life for years was beginning to thaw. One Sunday afternoon, Leah invited him over for dinner. "It's nothing fancy," she'd said, "just soup and bread." But to Graham it felt like a feast. Her home was small, filled with mismatched furniture and cozy warmth. There were hand-drawn pictures taped to the walls and a faint scent of lavender in the air. Poppy made him wear a paper crown she'd crafted from gold wrapping paper. "You're the king of the snow fort," she declared. Leah laughed so hard she nearly spilled her soup. "You're officially part of the royal court now, for the first time in years." Graham felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of his title, not because of his wealth, but because someone had seen him as more than the man who'd lost everything. That night, after dinner, he helped Leah wash the dishes. The sound of running water mixed with the quiet hum of a radio in the background. "Thank you for dinner," he said. She looked at him, smiling. "Thank you for showing up." He wanted to say more, about how her kindness had given him something to live for again, about how Poppy's laughter had brought warmth back into his house, about how every day with them felt like a small miracle. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "It's been a long time since anyone made me feel at home." She dried her hands slowly, her voice soft. "You deserve to feel that way, Graham." Later that night, when he returned to his own house, he noticed something he hadn't before. The place didn't feel empty anymore. It still looked the same, the tall windows, the quiet halls, but it no longer echoed the way it used to. There were traces of laughter now, small fingerprints on the glass, and the faint scent of cocoa still lingering in the air. He stood by the window, looking out at the street. The light from Leah's house glowed faintly in the distance, and he could just make out the silhouette of their snow fort, still standing proudly. Something inside him whispered that he was standing at the edge of something new, something that could change everything again, but this time for the better. And as he turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he realized that for the first time in 6 long winters, he wasn't dreading tomorrow. He was waiting for it, Spring rolled in slowly, like a long sigh after years of holding one's breath. The snow melted from the roofs of Pine Hollow, trickling down the streets into clear puddles that reflected a sky finally free of grey. The cold, once so sharp and relentless, gave way to a gentle warmth, the kind that carried the scent of wet earth and blooming lilacs. For Graham Elridge, this new season didn't just touch the town, it touched him. He found himself waking up earlier these days, no longer out of obligation or habit, but because there was something to look forward to. Sometimes it was the sound of Poppy's laughter when he stopped by Lia's place before work. Sometimes it was the smell of coffee from the cafe where Lia now managed the morning shift. Other times it was just knowing that the heavy silence that used to fill his house had been replaced by echoes of something softer. Life. One morning, he stood by his office window, gazing down at the bustling city below. People hurried through the streets, briefcases in hand, the world spinning as fast as ever. Yet for the first time in decades, Graham didn't feel like part of that race. His assistant, Clara, entered the room carrying a stack of files. "Mr. Elridge," she said, setting them on his desk. "The board meeting's been moved to Thursday. Oh, and you missed the gala RSVP deadline again." He smiled faintly. "That's all right, Clara. I don't think they'll miss me much." She raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised. "You used to never miss a gala," he nodded. "I used to never miss a lot of things." She hesitated, then smiled knowingly. "You seem different lately, happier." "Maybe I am," he said quietly. When she left, he turned back to the window. The reflection staring back at him wasn't the same man from last Christmas. Not quite. The lines around his eyes still told stories of loss, but they were softened now, as though hope had begun to draw over them with gentle brushstrokes. That afternoon, he closed his laptop early and drove through the winding road leading out of the city, past the familiar rows of pine trees that marked the entrance to Pine Hollow. It was a small detour, but one he found himself making more often than not. As he approached Lia's house, he saw Poppy sitting on the porch steps, a small cardboard box beside her. She jumped up when she saw his car pull in. "Mr. G," she shouted, waving wildly. "You're just in time." He stepped out of the car, smiling. "In time for what?" "For this!" She pointed proudly to the box. Inside was a tiny brown and white puppy with floppy ears and eyes too big for its head. Graham froze. "Is that a dog?" "Yep," Poppy grinned. "His name's Biscuit. Mommy said I could keep him if I take care of him. You can help too." Lia appeared at the door, holding a towel. "Before you say anything, she found him behind the bakery. Someone must have abandoned him. We couldn't just leave him there." Graham crouched down, watching the puppy wag its tail and lick Poppy's fingers. Something in that tiny creature's innocence stirred him. "He's adorable," he said softly, "and very lucky." Lia smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe we all are in some way." That afternoon, they spent hours in the backyard trying to teach Biscuit how to fetch. The puppy mostly chased his own tail and barked at his reflection in the window, sending Poppy into fits of giggles. Lia watched Graham from the porch, the sunlight catching his grey hair and the gentle way he smiled at every silly thing Poppy did. She had come to know him in pieces, through quiet moments, through shared silences. Beneath the polished exterior of the CEO she'd met that snowy night was a man still learning how to live again. As evening settled, Graham helped her bring in a basket of laundry. Inside, the house smelled of stew and freshly baked bread. Poppy sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching pictures of Biscuit in her notebook. "You know," Lia said as she stirred the pot, "I never imagined this is how my life would turn out." "How do you mean?" he asked. "I used to think happiness had to look a certain way. A perfect house, a perfect family, everything planned out. But now," she looked at him, her voice softening, "now I think it's more about the people who make the ordinary feel extraordinary." He smiled faintly. "I used to think the same. My wife and we spent so many years building things, chasing success. But the truth is, I think she was happiest during the small moments." Sunday mornings, burnt pancakes, music playing while she painted. I didn't see it then. Laya placed a hand on his arm. She'd be proud of who you are now. He looked at her, a quiet ache in his chest. I hope so. The night went on peacefully, filled with laughter and the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock. But later, as he was leaving, something unexpected happened. Just as he reached his car, Laya stepped out onto the porch. "Graham," she called softly. He turned. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." She hesitated, folding her arms. "Poppy's father. He's been trying to contact us." His heart sank a little. "I see. He left when she was barely a year old," she said quietly. "And now he says he wants to make things right. He wants to visit." Graham's face remained calm, but his chest felt tight. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants Poppy to have her father in her life. But another part of me..." Her voice faltered. "Another part of me is scared. We finally found peace. I don't want to lose that." He nodded slowly, trying to hide the turmoil inside him. "Whatever happens, Laya, you won't face it alone." She gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Graham." That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace. The thought of losing them, the warmth they brought into his life, twisted in his chest like a quiet storm. He realized how deeply they had become a part of him, how their laughter had mended something that had once felt beyond repair. The following week passed with uneasy quiet. Laya seemed distracted whenever they met, and Poppy, though cheerful, picked up on the tension. One afternoon, Graham drove to the cafe to find Laya sitting alone after closing hours, wiping the same table over and over. "He came," she said when he approached. Graham's heart sank. "And he wants us to move to Chicago," she whispered. "He says he has a stable job now, a house, and he wants to be a family again." He said nothing, his throat tightening. "I told him I'd think about it," she continued. "But Graham, I can't pretend it's simple. He's her father, and as much as I..." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "As much as I care about what we've built here, I don't want to take that from her." He swallowed hard. "I understand." When she finally looked up, her eyes glistened. "I wish things were different." He nodded once, then quietly left the cafe. The drive home was long, the road stretching endlessly beneath the soft drizzle of rain. The snow fort was gone now, melted into the earth, just like the season they'd shared. For the next few days, Graham buried himself in work again. The office lights stayed on late, the familiar hum of isolation returning. Yet it felt different this time, heavier. Every file he opened, every phone call he took felt hollow. He'd spent so long learning how to live again. And now it felt like the universe was testing him, asking whether he could hold on to hope when it was slipping through his fingers. Then, one evening, as he sat alone by the window, there was a knock on the door. The sound startled him, sharp, echoing through the quiet halls. He opened it to find Poppy standing there, raincoat dripping, holding Biscuit in her arms. "Mommy said I could come say goodbye," she said, her eyes wide. His heart froze. "Goodbye." "She says we might go to Chicago soon." Her voice wavered. "But I don't want to leave you, Mr. G." He crouched down, his eyes stinging. "Sometimes people have to go where life takes them, Poppy, but that doesn't mean goodbye forever," she sniffled. "Can I write you letters?" He smiled weakly. "I'd like that very much." She nodded, then hugged him tightly, a small pair of arms around a man who'd once thought he'd never feel warmth again. When she left, the door closed softly behind her, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Graham stood there for a long time, the ache in his chest deep and raw, and though he didn't know it yet, that moment, that quiet, heartbreaking goodbye would become the turning point that changed everything once more. The next few weeks drifted by like a blur of grey mornings and sleepless nights. Graham's house felt hollow again, not empty like before, but wounded, as though every corner still whispered the laughter that used to fill it. The smell of cocoa lingered faintly in the kitchen, and the snow fort outside had long melted into a patch of muddy ground, but somehow the memory of it remained as vivid as the day it was built. He tried to move on, tried to bury himself in work, in meetings, in polite conversations that never reached the heart. But no matter how much he tried to pretend, a single truth hung in the silence of his office. He missed them. Every morning, he found himself staring at his phone, half expecting a message from Laya, or maybe a drawing from Poppy, but the screen stayed blank. The days turned into weeks, and still nothing came. One evening, he found himself driving through Pine Hollow again, the sky painted in dusky gold. He didn't plan to. His car simply followed the familiar turns, as if his heart had taken control of the wheel. When he reached Laya's small house, it looked different. The windows were dark, the porch was bare, and the flower pots she'd tended so lovingly were empty. They were gone. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the house, the ache in his chest heavy and deep. Then he noticed something, a faint light flickering inside. Curiosity tugged at him. He got out, walked up to the door and knocked softly. No one answered. He turned to leave, but then he saw it, tucked beneath the old doormat, a small envelope, slightly weathered by the rain. His name was written across the front in delicate handwriting. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a letter, short, simple, but written with the kind of honesty that cuts straight through the heart. Dear Graham, if you're reading this, it means we've already left Pine Hollow. I didn't know how to say goodbye, not properly. You've done more for us than I can ever put into words. You gave Poppy safety, laughter, and a kind of love I thought was lost to the world. You reminded me that good men still exist. Her father wants to try again. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. Meeting you changed us. You showed us what home feels like. If it's meant to be, our paths will cross again. Until then, thank you for everything. With love, Laya. Graham stood there, the words blurring before his eyes. The paper shook slightly in his hands as he folded it carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. He didn't cry. Not then. Instead, he drove home in silence, the letter sitting on the passenger seat beside him like a piece of his heart he couldn't put back. The months that followed were quiet. Spring turned into summer, and summer faded into the soft gold of autumn. The world moved on, as it always does, but Graham found himself holding on to small things, the letter, the memory of snow, the sound of Poppy's giggle echoing in his mind. Sometimes he'd pass by the cafe where Laya once worked, only to find new faces behind the counter. Other times he'd visit the park where Poppy liked to feed the ducks. The bench they used to sit on was still there, and he'd sit for a while, feeding crumbs to the birds in silence. It wasn't sadness that filled him anymore, not entirely. It was something gentler, like gratitude wrapped in longing. They had entered his life like a sudden snowfall, unexpected, beautiful and brief. And though the season had passed, the imprint they left behind remained. One particularly cold November morning, as he prepared to head to the office, a familiar envelope arrived in the mail. There was no return address, just a single word written on the back, Poppy. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a drawing, messy, colorful, full of joy. It showed 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small, all standing beside a snow fort under a big blue sky. In the corner, written in crayon, were the words, "We miss you." Mr. G. Tears welled in his eyes before he even realized it. He placed the drawing on his desk, right beside a photo of his late wife, the 2 women who had changed his life in different ways, both reminding him that love doesn't end. It only changes form. Days turned into weeks again. Winter crept closer, painting the world white once more. Graham found himself preparing his house for Christmas, something he hadn't done since the night everything fell apart. He decorated the tree, lit the fireplace, and placed 2 extra mugs on the counter, just in case. It wasn't hope exactly, more like faith. A quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, some miracles don't happen in an instant. They grow slowly, like light returning after a long night. Then, on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after that fateful night, it happened again. A knock. Soft, hesitant, familiar. Graham froze, his heart pounding. He turned toward the door, unsure whether to believe his senses. Slowly, he walked across the living room, every step heavier than the last. When he opened it, the cold winter air rushed in, along with two figures standing in the snow, Laya and Poppy. For a moment, none of them spoke. Snowflakes fell gently between them, catching in Laya's hair, glimmering like tiny stars. Poppy clutched a small gift box in her mittened hands, her cheeks red from the cold. "Merry Christmas, Mr. G," she said softly. He stared at them, his throat too tight to speak. Finally, his voice broke through, shaky, disbelieving. You came back," Laya nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "We tried Chicago. It wasn't home. Poppy missed her school. I missed." She hesitated, her gaze meeting his. "I missed you." He stepped aside, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come in, please." The moment they entered, the house came alive again. Laughter, warmth, the faint sound of Biscuit's tiny paws tapping on the floor. Laya looked around, her eyes softening at the sight of the decorated tree. "You decorated," she said with a smile. He nodded. "I thought maybe this year I wouldn't be alone." Poppy ran to the fireplace, placing the small gift box on the mantel. "That's for you," she said proudly. "Open it!" He knelt down and untied the ribbon. Inside was a snow globe, a miniature version of a house surrounded by pine trees with two small figures inside, a man, a woman, and a child. When he shook it, snow swirled gently around them. "It's us," Poppy said, beaming. "Now you'll never be alone, even when it snows," he smiled, blinking back tears. "It's perfect." That night they shared dinner together, simple food, laughter, and music playing softly in the background. Laya told stories about Chicago, about how Poppy made friends with a neighbor's dog, and how she'd realized that happiness isn't tied to a place, but to people, when Poppy finally fell asleep on the couch. Clutching Biscuit, Laya and Graham sat by the fire, the room glowing in warm orange light. "I kept your letter," he said quietly. "Read it more times than I'd like to admit," she smiled gently. "And I kept your scarf. It still smells like cedar." They sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling softly between them. Then she reached across the small space and took his hand, tentative at first, then certain. "I don't know where this will lead," she whispered, "but I know what feels right." He squeezed her hand lightly. "Then let's not waste another winter." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, silent, endless. The same snow that had once brought strangers together now blanketed their world in peace. For the first time in years, Graham didn't feel like he was waiting for Christmas to end. He was living it, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and love that had returned when he least expected it. And as he looked at Laya and Poppy sleeping by the fire, he realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest gifts aren't the ones we plan for, but the ones that knock on our door when the world feels coldest. That Christmas, the man who once waited alone finally had his miracle, and this time it was one he would never let go of. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional and heartwarming stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story that might just change the way you see love, hope, and humanity.